David would never forget the day his entire world crumbled. It began like any other mundane Tuesday, filled with work emails, his son Ethan's half-hearted attempts at homework, and the familiar hum of the coffee maker in the background. Nothing seemed off, nothing warned him of the storm brewing in the distance. If he'd known, perhaps he would have acted differently, though in hindsight, he doubted it. Some disasters are simply inevitable. He sat in the living room, scrolling through bills on his laptop, when the notifications suddenly appeared. Your balance has fallen below the minimum threshold. That was odd. The college fund had more than enough in it, 6 years of careful saving for Ethan's future. David and his wife, Sarah, had both agreed it was untouchable. It wasn't even a conversation they needed to revisit because they both knew how much it meant, or so he thought. David quickly logged into the account, expecting to see some kind of mistake, perhaps a glitch. Banks mess up all the time, right? But no, the truth hit him like a freight train. The account was empty. Not low balance empty, but zero. No transactions in sight. He stared at the screen, the numbers burning into his eyes, desperately hoping it was some twisted joke, but it wasn't. Sarah. David called, his voice shaky. No response. Sarah, he tried again, louder this time, but the silence that answered was deafening. She wasn't home. That's when the sinking realization crept in. Sarah had been acting strange for weeks, slightly distant, dressed up for errands, and brushing off questions about her whereabouts with vague excuses. David had chalked it up to stress, life, whatever, never once considering something more sinister. He grabbed his phone and dialed her number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again, with the same result. His heart pounded, every beat thudding in his chest like a drum. Ethan wandered into the room, munching on an apple, oblivious to the chaos unraveling before him. "Where's Mom?" David asked, trying to sound calm for his son's sake. Ethan shrugged, taking another bite. "She said she had to go somewhere." Somewhere. That word felt like a dagger twisting in David's gut. His hands shook as he opened their joint credit card account. He didn't want to see what he already suspected, but he couldn't stop himself. And there it was, transaction after transaction. Flights, luxury hotels, high-end restaurants. His wife was halfway across the country, living it up on money meant for their son's future. David didn't want Ethan to see him fall apart, but it was difficult. His mind raced with questions. How could she do this? How could she take from their son, the one person who had nothing to do with their marital issues? Sure, they'd been arguing lately. Sure, things hadn't been perfect. But this was unforgivable. Ethan must have noticed something from the look on David's face because he came over and placed a gentle hand on his father's shoulder. "Dad, it's fine," Ethan said with a smile that seemed too calm, too knowing. "I fixed everything." At the time, David thought Ethan was just trying to make him feel better. Kids don't understand the weight of betrayal, the depth of loss. They see things in black and white, good guys and bad guys, problems and solutions. David wanted to believe his son's words were innocent, but even then, something about Ethan's tone felt off. Like he knew more than he was letting on. David didn't have the energy to press Ethan. His focus remained firmly on Sarah. He tried calling again, but it was useless. It wasn't until later that night, when David checked the closet and saw Sarah's suitcase missing, that the truth hit him with full force. She wasn't coming back. She had emptied the account, packed her bags, and walked out on her family, on him, on Ethan. The anger came in waves, each one more intense than the last. David wasn't just furious with her, he was furious with himself. How could he have missed the signs? How could he have let this happen right under his nose? Every transaction, every lie, played on repeat in his mind, like a cruel movie he couldn't turn off. Ethan remained quiet most of the evening, observing David with that same calm expression. When Ethan finally went to bed, David sat alone in the dark, replaying the last few months, desperately trying to find answers. But there weren't any. There was just a gaping hole where trust used to be and a betrayal so deep it threatened to swallow him whole. David wished he could say he'd found some clarity that night, some resolve to move forward, but he didn't. All he discovered was the cold, bitter truth. The woman he loved had chosen herself over her family, and there was no coming back from that. What David didn't know, as he sat there drowning in grief, was that Ethan had already begun working on a solution David couldn't have imagined in his wildest dreams. The days following Sarah's betrayal blurred together. David was barely functional, running on autopilot, consumed by anger, confusion, and heartbreak. But Ethan remained unshaken. In fact, he appeared eerily composed for a 10-year-old whose mother had just abandoned him. He still went to school, still completed his homework, and still played with his Legos as though nothing had changed. Initially, David chalked Ethan's demeanor up to shock. Kids process trauma differently, right? But soon it became clear Ethan wasn't ignoring the situation, he was working on it. It began subtly. David would occasionally catch Ethan typing furiously on his tablet, his face scrunched in concentration. Whenever Ethan noticed his father watching, he quickly minimized the screen, dismissing it casually with a simple, "Just homework, Dad." David didn't think much of it initially. Ethan had always been a whiz with technology, coding, gaming, or whatever else caught his interest. Then came the whispered phone calls. One evening, David caught Ethan in the kitchen, phone pressed to his ear. "Who are you talking to?" David asked. Ethan jumped, startled like a deer caught in headlights. Nobody," Ethan mumbled quickly, shoving the phone into his pocket and rushing out of the room. David didn't press further. He figured Ethan might be talking to a friend, or perhaps even a counselor from school. Everyone coped with grief differently, David reasoned. Maybe this was Ethan's method. Soon afterward, Ethan began spending hours in the garage, tinkering with tools and wires. At first, David didn't pay much attention. He assumed Ethan was working on another one of his little engineering projects. Ethan had always been talented at building things, robots, model planes, stuff like that. But one night, curiosity got the better of David. Quietly, he wandered into the garage to check on Ethan. What he saw stopped him cold. A large whiteboard stood against the wall, covered in intricate diagrams, complex equations, and detailed flowcharts. It looked straight out of a spy movie. Beside it sat a laptop, lines of code scrolling rapidly across the screen. Ethan was at the workbench, soldering something that looked suspiciously like a listening device. Seeing David, Ethan immediately jumped up, trying to shield the whiteboard with his small frame. "What's all this?" David asked, genuinely baffled. "Nothing, Dad, just a school project," Ethan replied hastily, far too defensively. David raised an eyebrow skeptically. "A school project? Since when does 4th grade require surveillance equipment?" Ethan's face flushed red. For a fleeting second, David thought his son might actually confess. Instead, Ethan just shrugged, muttered, "You wouldn't get it," then quickly packed up his tools and headed inside. David stood there, staring at the whiteboard, his head spinning. Whatever Ethan was working on, it clearly wasn't for school, and it certainly wasn't a mere hobby. Over the following days, Ethan's strange behavior escalated. He began asking oddly specific questions about Sarah's finances. Did she have other accounts? Did David know her passwords? Had she ever mentioned offshore investments? Initially, David thought Ethan was merely curious, but soon he realized his son was systematically gathering information. "Why do you need to know all this?" David asked one evening, suspicion mounting. "No reason," Ethan replied, not looking up from his tablet. "Just wondering." David's voice hardened slightly. "Ethan, this isn't normal. If something's bothering you, you need to tell me." Ethan finally looked up, expression unreadable. "I told you, Dad. I'm fixing it. You'll see." That night, David couldn't sleep. Ethan's words kept echoing in his mind. Fixing it. What could he possibly mean by that? David thought about confronting him, demanding answers. Yet something held him back, perhaps exhaustion or maybe some small, irrational part of him trusted Ethan, trusted that his son really did know what he was doing. The next morning, David found Ethan in the kitchen typing away on his laptop, oblivious to his father's presence. Ethan's fingers flew across the keyboard with confidence far beyond his age. "Ethan," David said softly. Ethan froze, turning slowly. "Yeah, Dad?" David hesitated. He desperately wanted to ask what Ethan was doing, what he planned. But the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply said, "Breakfast is ready," and walked away. Looking back, David knew he should have pressed Ethan harder, demanded answers. Yet a part of him didn't want to know, afraid of what he might discover. In the following days, Ethan's secrecy intensified. He stopped leaving his tablet unattended, locked the garage whenever he worked, and even started covering the whiteboard with a sheet when he wasn't using it. Then, just as David convinced himself it might all be harmless, his phone rang. It was late afternoon. David stood at the kitchen sink, staring blankly out the window, still piecing his life back together. Ethan sat in the living room, completely absorbed by his tablet, as usual. David glanced at the caller ID and froze. It was Sarah. David's first instinct was to let the call ring out. Why should he answer? What could Sarah possibly say to justify what she'd done? But curiosity won out, and despite his better judgment, he picked up the phone. "What do you want?" His voice was colder and sharper than he'd intended, but he didn't care. "David," Sarah cried, her voice frantic and trembling. "Oh my God, David, you have to help me." The audacity of her request made his blood boil. "Help you?" he spat bitterly. "You emptied our son's college fund and ran off with your boyfriend. Why on earth would I help you?" "David, please, just listen," she begged, her voice cracking with panic. "Something's gone wrong. Everything's gone wrong." He leaned against the counter, gripping the edge to steady himself. "What are you talking about?" "It's Michael," she said, almost sobbing. "He's gone, just disappeared. All his accounts are frozen, and so are mine. I can't access anything, David. Nothing. And now the police are looking for me." Her words hit him like a slap, but it wasn't sympathy he felt, it was satisfaction. Cold-hearted satisfaction. David wanted to ask how it felt to be stranded, powerless, abandoned, the way she'd left Ethan and him. But he stayed silent, letting her dig her own grave. "David, please," she continued desperately. "I don't know what's happening. I don't know who did this, but I need your help. I'm stuck in Miami with no money, no ID, nothing. Michael said he'd take care of everything, and now he's just gone." "Sounds like a real stand-up guy," David replied dryly, unable to resist the jab. She didn't acknowledge it, too consumed by her panic. "I swear, David, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You just what, Sarah?" David snapped, his anger finally boiling over. You just stole from your own son. You just walked out on your family for some guy who clearly doesn't give a damn about you. Is that what you didn't mean to happen? There was a long pause on her end, broken only by the sound of her shaky breathing. I made a mistake, she whispered finally. A mistake. David barked out a bitter laugh. You don't get to call this a mistake, Sarah. You made a choice, a selfish, cruel choice, and now you're paying for it. David, please, she said again, barely audible. I have nothing. I don't know what to do. I need you. Before David could respond, Ethan appeared in the doorway holding his tablet. Who's on the phone? He asked casually, as if this were any other day. David covered the receiver and whispered, It's your mom. Ethan's face darkened briefly, but then that same calm, knowing smile returned. Put it on speaker, he said. Ethan. Trust me, Dad. Put it on speaker. Something in Ethan's tone made David hesitate. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Confused, he obeyed, pressing the speaker button and placing the phone on the counter. Sarah, David said, voice hardening, you're on speaker now. Ethan's here. There was a sharp intake of breath on her end. Ethan, she said, her voice softening. Sweetheart, it's Mommy, I. Save it, Ethan interrupted coldly, emotionless. I don't want to hear it. Ethan, please, Sarah pleaded. I know I hurt you, I know I made a mistake, but... You didn't just make a mistake, Ethan cut her off again, voice firm. You betrayed us. You stole my future. Now you're calling because you need our help. That's pathetic. David stared at him, stunned. This wasn't the voice of a 10-year-old, this was someone older, wiser, someone darker. Ethan, Sarah whispered, voice breaking, I'm your mother. I love you, I didn't mean. You don't love me, Ethan replied bluntly. If you did, you wouldn't have left. You wouldn't have stolen from me. You chose Michael over us, and now you're paying the price. I don't feel sorry for you. You deserve this. Ethan, please, she sobbed, I'm begging you, help me. He smiled then, a chilling, confident smile that sent a shiver down David's spine. Don't worry, Mom, he said calmly. I already did. What? She asked, confused. Let's just say, Ethan replied almost gleefully, Michael won't be around to hurt anyone anymore, and neither will you. The line went dead. David stood frozen, staring at Ethan, his mind racing. What did you do? He whispered. Ethan looked up calmly, almost proudly. I told you, Dad, I fixed everything. David didn't know whether to feel proud, horrified, or completely confused. His 10-year-old son had just silenced his panicking mother with a cryptic remark, leaving David more unsettled than ever. His mind raced with possibilities, each more absurd than the last. What could Ethan have possibly done? He was just a kid, right? Ethan, David tried again, struggling to keep his voice steady. What exactly did you do? Ethan shrugged casually, as though discussing his math homework. It's like I said, Dad, Mom and Michael can't hurt us anymore. David felt his stomach twist into knots. Ethan, this isn't a game. You have to tell me exactly what you've done. Ethan sighed like a parent indulging a child's endless questions and motioned David to follow him into the living room. Fine. I'll show you. They sat down on the couch, and Ethan opened his tablet. The screen lit up with a dizzying array of charts, bank statements, and complex coding scripts. David's pulse quickened as Ethan began explaining, his voice calm and methodical, as if presenting a school science project. Remember how Mom drained my college fund? Ethan began matter-of-factly. Well, I figured if she could take the money, I could take it back. David stared at him, speechless, as Ethan pulled up a series of bank transactions. Sure enough, the $50,000 Sarah had stolen was back in the account, not just sitting there, but reorganized and reinvested in ways that made David's head spin. How did you? David stammered. Easy, Ethan replied, as if hacking bank accounts was as simple as tying his shoes. Mom wasn't exactly careful with her passwords. I just used the ones she saved on her phone to access her accounts. Michael's, too, he wasn't any smarter. Once I was in, I transferred the money back where it belongs. That's illegal, David said weakly, his voice lacking conviction. Ethan shrugged again. So is stealing from your kid. David couldn't argue with that, but his unease deepened as Ethan continued scrolling. The bank transfers were just the beginning. Ethan had done much more. Michael had a bunch of accounts in his name, Ethan said, pointing to the screen. Turns out he's been scamming people for years, fake investments, shell companies, stuff like that. I reported everything to the authorities and gave them all the evidence they need to lock him up for good. You reported him? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Yep, Ethan said confidently. I even made sure the trail led back to Mom. She helped him spend the money, so technically she's part of the scam. Now the police are watching her, too. David felt a surge of panic rise. Ethan, do you understand what you've done? This isn't just about getting the money back, you've put your mother in serious trouble. She put herself in trouble, Ethan shot back sharply. She chose Michael over us, chose herself over us. Why should I feel sorry for her? David didn't know how to respond. Ethan was right, of course. Sarah had betrayed them in the worst possible way. But hearing those words come from his son's mouth, delivered with such icy detachment, made David's chest ache. This wasn't just a 10-year-old taking a stand, this was something darker, colder. And Michael? David asked, dreading the answer. What did you mean when you said he won't be around anymore? Ethan grinned. Oh, don't worry. He's fine, for now. He just doesn't have any money or anywhere to hide. The authorities froze all his accounts. By the time they find him, he'll be broke and in jail. The casual way Ethan said it, as if destroying a man's life was as simple as squashing a bug, sent chills down David's spine. Ethan, David said carefully, why didn't you tell me about this before? Why didn't you let me handle it? Ethan's expression softened slightly. Because I knew you wouldn't do anything. You would have let her get away with it because you're too nice. Someone had to stop her, Dad, someone had to protect us. David felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. His son, his sweet, brilliant boy, had taken it upon himself not just to fix their situation but to exact revenge in a way David couldn't have dreamed of. He didn't know whether to be proud of Ethan's resourcefulness or terrified of what it meant. Ethan, David said after a long pause, I'm not sure this is the right way to handle things. Ethan tilted his head, his calm demeanor unwavering. Maybe not. But it worked. David leaned back on the couch, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know what to say, what to feel. Ethan had done what David couldn't, taken control of a hopeless situation and turned it completely around. But at what cost? Ethan closed his tablet and looked up with that same unnerving confidence. Don't worry, Dad. Everything's going to be okay now. Yet, as David sat staring at him, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were far from okay. That night, David didn't sleep much. How could he? The sheer magnitude of what Ethan had done kept replaying in his mind like a movie on an endless loop. His 10-year-old son had engineered a scheme so intricate, so devastating, it left two adults utterly ruined. Worst of all, Ethan didn't seem to feel even the slightest shred of guilt about it. David promised himself he'd talk to Ethan in the morning. But life, as always, had other plans. David's phone rang again early the next morning. Sarah. His first instinct was to ignore the call. After all, what could she possibly say now? Yet a small, bitter part of him wanted to hear her squirm, so he answered. What? He barked, not bothering with pleasantries. David, please, she sobbed. I'm begging you. I need your help. The sound of her voice was almost unrecognizable. Gone was the confident, self-assured woman who'd walked out of their lives without a second thought. In her place was someone desperate and broken. You've got some nerve calling me, David said coldly. Just listen, she pleaded, her words tumbling out frantically. The police are after me. They've frozen all my accounts. Michael's gone, he vanished. I don't even know where he is. I'm stuck, David. I have no money and nowhere to go. And whose fault is that? David cut in sharply, his anger rising again. David, please, she cried. I know I messed up. I know I hurt you and Ethan. But I didn't deserve this. I don't deserve to be left with nothing. David let out a bitter laugh. You emptied our son's college fund, ran off with your boyfriend, and now you're crying because the consequences caught up with you. You deserve every last bit of this, Sarah.
There was silence on the other end, broken only by her shaky breathing. I didn't think it would get this bad, she whispered. You didn't think at all. David snapped. You were too busy living it up with Michael to care about what you left behind. Well, guess what? You made your bed, now you get to lie in it. She started sobbing loudly, uncontrollably. David, I'm begging you. Just help me get out of this mess. I don't have anyone else to turn to. David felt his jaw tighten. Anyone else to turn to? The sheer audacity of her words made his blood boil. After everything she'd done, she had the gall to act like a victim, as though he owed her something. There's nothing I can do for you, David said flatly. Don't say that, she pleaded. You can talk to the police, tell them it was all Michael's fault. Because lying to cover for you worked out so well the first time, David shot back sharply. No, Sarah. I'm done cleaning up your messes. David, please, she shouted, her voice breaking. If not for me, then do it for Ethan. Do it for him. That was the final straw. Don't you dare bring Ethan into this, David warned, voice dangerously low. You don't get to play the concerned mother now, not after what you did to him. You made it perfectly clear where your priorities lie, and they weren't with your family. I'm sorry, she cried desperately. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, I just wanted to be happy. Happy? David repeated, voice dripping disbelief. You think stealing from your son and running off with some loser was going to make you happy? Congratulations, Sarah. You got exactly what you wanted. Now you can deal with the consequences. Another long silence stretched between them. For a moment, David thought she'd hung up. But then she spoke again, her voice small and broken. Is this really how it's going to be? You're just going to abandon me like this? The sheer irony of her words almost made David laugh. You abandoned us first, he said simply. And no, Sarah, I'm not abandoning you, I'm just letting you deal with the mess you created. Goodbye. He hung up before she could reply. When David turned around, Ethan stood in the doorway, watching him calmly. You didn't let her off the hook, did you? Ethan asked quietly. No, David said, exhaustion weighing heavily on his voice. I didn't. Ethan nodded, as if that were the only acceptable answer. Good. She doesn't deserve our help. David wanted to explain that it wasn't that simple, that no matter how much he hated Sarah for what she'd done, a part of him still struggled with leaving her to fend for herself. But looking at Ethan, at the steely resolve in his son's eyes, David knew Ethan wouldn't understand, or perhaps he understood too well, and that terrified David even more. Ethan, David began carefully, what you're doing isn't normal. This isn't how a 10-year-old should think. I'm not a normal 10-year-old, Ethan replied bluntly. David had no answer for that. If David had learned anything, it was that people like Michael didn't simply roll over when cornered, they lashed out, making as much noise and causing as much damage as possible on their way down. That's precisely what happened next. It began with a phone call, not from Sarah this time. He'd blocked her number. Instead, it was a number he didn't recognize. Against his better judgment, David answered, thinking perhaps the authorities had finally caught up with Michael. David, the voice growled on the other end, low, dangerous, filled with venom. You think you're so clever, don't you? David froze, recognizing the voice instantly. It was Michael. Michael, David replied flatly. Shouldn't you be in hiding by now? Michael let out a bitter laugh. Oh, I'm in hiding, all right, thanks to you and your little brat. You think you can ruin my life and just walk away? David glanced toward the living room, where Ethan calmly sat assembling a model car as though nothing in the world could touch him. For a moment, David considered denying everything or playing dumb. But what was the point? Michael already knew. You got what you deserved, David said evenly, trying to maintain control. You stole from my family. Did you really think there wouldn't be consequences? You don't know who you're dealing with, Michael snarled. You think this is over? It's not over, not by a long shot. What are you going to do, Michael? David asked, patience wearing thin. You're broke, you're wanted, you're finished. Maybe, Michael said chillingly, but I'm not going down alone. I know where you live, David. I know where your son goes to school. If you think I'll sit back and let you destroy me, you're dead wrong. David's blood ran cold. Michael wasn't bluffing. He was many things, a liar, a thief, a coward, but he wasn't one to make empty threats. You stay away from my son, David warned, his voice shaking despite his best efforts. Or what? Michael taunted. You're going to sick your little hacker on me again? Go ahead, let's see how far he's willing to go. David hung up before Michael could say another word. His hands trembled as he set the phone down on the kitchen counter, trying to process what had just happened. Who was that? Ethan asked calmly, startling David from his thoughts. Michael, David replied, turning to face him. He knows what you've done. He's threatening us. Ethan didn't even flinch. Let him try, he said coldly. Ethan, this isn't a game, David said firmly, kneeling in front of him. This man is dangerous. We need to call the police. No, Ethan interrupted sharply. The police won't do anything until it's too late. But I can handle this. Ethan. Dad, Ethan cut him off again. Trust me. I've got this. David wanted to argue, to tell Ethan this was far beyond what any 10-year-old should handle, that protecting them wasn't Ethan's responsibility. But the look in Ethan's eyes stopped him. It wasn't the look of a frightened child, it was the look of someone who'd already made up his mind. That night, Ethan disappeared into the garage again, locking the door behind him. David didn't have the strength to stop him. Instead, he stayed awake, pacing the living room, replaying Michael's threats over and over in his mind. Every noise outside made him jump, every shadow felt menacing. It was well past midnight when Ethan finally emerged, looking tired but satisfied. A small smile tugged at his lips. It's done, Ethan said simply. What's done? David asked, dread pooling in his stomach. Without a word, Ethan handed David his tablet. David's heart sank as he read the screen. Ethan had tracked Michael's location using advanced GPS spoofing software. More alarmingly, he'd hacked into Michael's burner phone, recording every threatening message Michael had sent. To top it off, Ethan had anonymously tipped off the authorities, providing them with all the evidence they'd need to arrest Michael.
Ethan, David stammered, disbelief mixing with awe. Do you have any idea what you've just done? I stopped him, Ethan said matter-of-factly. He can't hurt us now. David desperately wanted to believe him, to think this nightmare was finally over, that Michael would be captured, and they'd finally be safe. But deep down, he knew better. People like Michael didn't give up easily. Sure enough, the next morning, David awoke to a loud crash. A brick had shattered their front window. Attached to it was a note scrawled in angry, messy handwriting, "This isn't over." Ethan found it before David did. He read the note, crumpled it up without a word, and threw it into the trash. Ethan, David began cautiously, maybe we should leave. Go somewhere safe until this blows over. Ethan looked up, calm and resolute. We don't need to run, Dad. I have one more move to make. David stared at him, heart pounding. One more move. What do you mean? Ethan smiled, a small, chilling smile that sent a shiver down David's spine. You'll see. David couldn't shake the uneasy feeling those words stirred. Ethan had spoken so casually, so confidently, as though the chaos overwhelming their lives was just a game he was determined to win. But this wasn't a game, not when David had spent the night taping cardboard over broken glass, terrified Michael would return with something worse than a brick. 2 tense days passed in silence. Ethan acted as if nothing had happened, but David could sense his son's mind constantly turning. David didn't dare ask about Ethan's plans, part of him didn't want to know. Perhaps, he reasoned, if he stayed out of it, he could pretend his 10-year-old wasn't masterminding a battle against a grown criminal. Then, without warning, everything changed. It was late in the afternoon when the doorbell rang. David's stomach sank. No one had visited since the brick incident, and he certainly wasn't expecting anyone. Ethan glanced up from his tablet, his expression unreadable. "Don't answer it," David warned instinctively, voice low. Ethan didn't reply. Instead, he stood up calmly, walked to the door, and peered through the peephole. Without hesitation, he unlocked it and swung it open. Standing in the doorway, larger than life and twice as angry, was Michael. His face twisted in fury, eyes bloodshot and wild. He no longer resembled the smug, confident man David had seen in Sarah's old photos. This Michael looked desperate and dangerous. "Where is he?" Michael growled, stepping inside without invitation. David quickly moved to block his path, heart pounding. "You need to leave," he demanded, forcing himself to sound steady. Michael sneered. "Oh, I'm not going anywhere, not until your little brat explains how he ruined my life." To David's horror, Ethan stepped forward, arms folded calmly across his chest. "You did that all by yourself," Ethan said evenly. Michael's jaw tightened dangerously. "Listen, you little." "You're broke," Ethan interrupted sharply, tone cutting like ice. "You're wanted in 3 states. And now you're here threatening me and my dad." "Smart move." David reached for Ethan, intending to pull him back. "Ethan, stop," he hissed urgently. But Ethan didn't stop. Instead, he stepped even closer, staring directly into Michael's eyes. "You shouldn't have come here. You're just making things worse for yourself." Michael barked out a harsh laugh. "Worse? Kid, I've got nothing left to lose." "That's where you're wrong," Ethan replied coolly, his lips curling into a small, chilling smile. Before David could react, Ethan reached into his pocket and withdrew a small device, something David didn't recognize. Ethan pressed a button, and suddenly Michael's phone buzzed in his pocket. Confused, Michael pulled it out, his expression shifting from confusion to alarm as a series of files popped up rapidly on his screen. "What the hell is this?" Michael demanded, panic creeping into his voice. "Proof," Ethan said simply. Michael's eyes flicked across the screen, his face reddening with anger. "You little." "Proof that you're a threat," Ethan continued coldly, cutting him off. "Every message you've sent, every call you've made, every threat, you've left a trail. Now the authorities have it." Michael's eyes blazed furiously. "You're bluffing." Ethan tilted his head calmly. "Am I?" In that chilling moment, David realized what Ethan had done. Ethan hadn't simply gathered evidence, he'd set a trap. Michael's phone wasn't just buzzing with files, it was actively streaming a live feed straight to local law enforcement. Ethan had turned Michael's own threats into his downfall. Michael lunged forward, rage contorting his features. But before he could take another step, the sound of sirens filled the air. Ethan didn't flinch, eyes locked onto Michael. "That'll be for you," Ethan said calmly. Michael froze, glancing toward the window, where flashing blue and red lights confirmed his worst fears. Turning back to Ethan, his face a mixture of fury and panic, he spat, "This isn't over." "Yes, it is," Ethan replied, voice cold and final. Seconds later, police burst through the doorway, guns drawn. Michael didn't resist, he knew it was over. As they led him away, David stood frozen in stunned silence, unable to process everything that had just unfolded. Ethan turned to David, expression unreadable. "I told you I had one more move," he said quietly. "Ethan," David said shakily, "do you have any idea how dangerous that was? He could have hurt you, could have hurt both of us." "But he didn't," Ethan replied matter-of-factly, "and now he's gone." David wanted to yell, to demand answers, to make Ethan understand this wasn't normal, that none of this was okay. But all he could do was stand there, staring at the child who had just outmaneuvered a grown criminal. Ethan looked up at him calmly but tiredly. "It's over now, Dad. We're safe." But as David watched the police car disappear down the street, he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that nothing about this was safe. The house fell eerily quiet after Michael's arrest. The chaos, threats, and lingering fear seemed to dissipate instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence, a heavy, suffocating quiet filled with questions David wasn't sure he wanted answered. David thought this was finally the end. Michael was out of their lives, Ethan had resumed his usual routine, and now David could focus on rebuilding whatever remained of their family. But just as he began to relax, his phone rang once again. It was Sarah. David recognized the number immediately. He'd blocked her primary line, but she'd found another way to contact him. He considered ignoring it. After everything, what more could she possibly say? But curiosity won out. He needed to hear it himself. With a heavy sigh, he picked up the call. "What now, Sarah?" he said, his voice colder than ice. Sarah's voice was barely recognizable, weak and hoarse, like someone who hadn't slept in days. "David," she began softly, but her words quickly faltered. "I don't have time for your sob stories," David snapped harshly. "If you're calling to beg for money or forgiveness, you're wasting your breath." "I don't want your money," she said quietly, almost defeated. "I don't even know what I want." Her words caught David off guard. For the first time since this nightmare had started, there was no arrogance in her voice, no entitlement, only raw, unfiltered defeat. "Then why are you calling?" he asked sharply, though his tone had softened slightly. "I'm in trouble, David," she admitted. "Real trouble." "You don't say," David replied sarcastically. She ignored his jab, continuing urgently. "The police are investigating me. They think I'm involved in Michael's scams." "Weren't you?" David shot back, letting the accusation hang in the air. Sarah hesitated before answering, her voice trembling. "I didn't know what he was doing at first. By the time I realized, it was already too late. I was already tied to everything. Now they're freezing my accounts, seizing my assets. I have nothing left, nothing." "That makes two of us," David said coldly. "Or did you forget you wiped out Ethan's college fund to finance your little adventure?" "I was stupid," Sarah admitted, her voice breaking. "I thought Michael loved me. I thought he'd take care of me." David let out a bitter laugh. "And how's that working out for you?" She didn't respond. Her silence spoke volumes. "Why are you really calling me, Sarah?" David asked again, softer this time, though no less firm. "Because you're all I have left," she whispered. "You and Ethan." Her words hit David like a punch to the gut, Not because they moved him emotionally, but because they were so utterly delusional. You don't have us, David stated firmly. You lost us the moment you chose Michael over your family. David, please, Sarah pleaded, her voice cracking with desperation. I made a mistake, I know I messed up, but I'm still Ethan's mother. I just need a second chance. A second chance. David repeated incredulously. This wasn't a minor slip-up, Sarah. You stole from your own child. You abandoned him for a man you barely knew. Now that your perfect fantasy has come crashing down, you want to crawl back. No, absolutely not. Her sobs filled the phone line, but David didn't waver. He couldn't. David, I don't have anywhere else to go, she said, desperation seeping into every word. That's not my problem, David replied coldly. What about Ethan? She asked, her voice trembling. Doesn't he deserve to have his mother in his life? Ethan doesn't need you, David responded bluntly. He's done more for this family in the last few weeks than you ever have, and he's done it without you. We don't need you, Sarah, not anymore. The line went silent. For a moment, David thought she'd hung up. Then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. So that's it. You're just going to turn your back on me. David laughed bitterly. You turned your back on us first. Now you're just reaping what you've sown. She didn't respond. David heard her shaky, uneven breathing, and then the call disconnected. When David turned around, Ethan stood in the doorway, quietly watching him with the same calm expression he always wore. Was that Mom again? Ethan asked, expression unreadable. David nodded slowly. Yes. What did she want? To come back, David replied simply. Ethan didn't flinch. Did you tell her no? I did. Good, Ethan said firmly, clearly satisfied. She doesn't deserve to come back. David wanted to explain that forgiveness should be part of the process, that it wasn't as straightforward as Ethan made it sound. But looking at Ethan, composed and confident, David couldn't bring himself to say those words. Perhaps Ethan was right. Maybe some actions truly were unforgivable. In the following days, David couldn't stop replaying everything Ethan had done, everything he'd orchestrated. It was impossible not to marvel at Ethan's brilliance. The 10-year-old boy had managed to outwit adults, dismantle a criminal scheme, and save their family from ruin, all while maintaining unnerving composure. It was undeniably impressive, but equally terrifying. Ethan didn't behave like a normal child. He didn't respond to threats with fear or hesitation. Instead, he calculated, strategized, and executed with ruthless precision, as if every decision were part of a grand chess game only he could see. And though David couldn't deny the effectiveness of Ethan's actions, he couldn't ignore the chilling detachment behind them. One evening, as David sat on the couch staring at the cardboard covering the shattered window, Ethan entered quietly. He wore the same calm, confident expression as always, but David noticed something heavier in Ethan's eyes. Dad, Ethan said quietly, sitting beside him, are you mad at me? The question caught David off guard. Mad at you? For what? For everything I did, Ethan explained plainly. For going after Mom and Michael, for not telling you. David sighed deeply, unsure how to respond. David ran a hand through his hair, struggling to find the right words. Ethan, he started carefully, what you did isn't something a 10-year-old should ever have to do. Honestly, it's not something anyone should have to do. But I did it, Ethan replied calmly. And it worked. It did, David admitted, exhaling slowly, but it's not just about whether it worked. It's about what it means. Ethan frowned slightly, confusion in his eyes. What do you mean? David hesitated, searching for the right way to explain his fears. "Ethan, the way you handled things, it wasn't normal or healthy. You shouldn't have to think or act that way. You're still just a kid." Ethan's expression didn't change. "I did what needed to be done. If I hadn't, who would have stopped them?" David wanted to argue, to tell Ethan it wasn't his responsibility, that he, as Ethan's father, should have handled everything. But deep down, David knew Ethan was right. He himself had been paralyzed by anger, confusion, and grief, too overwhelmed by his pain to take action. Ethan had stepped in precisely because David hadn't, and that realization cut deeper than anything else. "You're incredibly smart, Ethan," David finally said after a long pause. "Smarter than I'll ever be. But you're also my son, and it's my job to protect you, not the other way around." Ethan looked directly into David's eyes, searching carefully. "But what if you can't?" he asked softly. "What if it's up to me?" David had no answer. How could he, when the proof was staring him in the face? Ethan had protected them, had saved them. But at what cost? In the weeks that followed, life gradually returned to normal, or at least as normal as it could be. Michael was behind bars, and Sarah had gone silent, likely consumed by her own legal troubles. The house was quiet and peaceful once more, yet the peace felt fragile, like thin glass waiting to shatter at the slightest touch. One afternoon, David found Ethan in the garage working on a new project, a sleek, meticulously crafted drone, wires and circuits neatly arranged. Ethan glanced up when David entered, offering a small smile. "Hey, Dad," he said casually, "what's up?" David leaned against the doorway, watching Ethan work. "You're always building something, aren't you?" Ethan shrugged. "I like it. It keeps my mind busy." "That's a good thing," David said carefully. "But Ethan, you don't always have to be fixing things. Sometimes it's okay to let things just be." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He focused intently on soldering a tiny wire, his hands steady and precise. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "I don't know how to do that." "What do you mean?" Ethan set down the soldering iron, looking seriously at his father. "I don't know how to just let things be. If something's broken, I have to fix it. If there's a problem, I have to solve it. That's just how I think." David wanted to tell Ethan he didn't have to carry that burden, that it wasn't his responsibility to fix everything. But he knew better. Ethan wasn't like other kids. He saw the world differently, and no reassurance from David would ever change that. "You've got a gift, Ethan," David finally said softly. "But it's also a responsibility. One day you'll have to decide how to use it, and who to trust with it." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "I know." David watched his son for a moment longer, his chest tightening with a mixture of pride and worry. Ethan was undeniably brilliant, but brilliance could be a double-edged sword. It could build or destroy, heal or hurt. David could only hope Ethan would choose wisely as he grew older. That night, as David lay in bed, Sarah's final words echoed hauntingly in his mind. "You raised a son who doesn't just survive, he conquers. But be careful, David. One day, his heart might be too cold to save." David didn't want to believe her warning, but the thought lingered persistently. Ethan was more than a survivor, he was a force to be reckoned with. While David felt immense pride in his son's resourcefulness and courage, he couldn't shake the fear that Ethan's brilliance, left unchecked, might someday lead him down a path David couldn't follow. But for now, they had peace. And David was determined to protect it, for both their sakes. Weeks turned into months, and life quietly moved forward. David watched carefully as Ethan continued building new creations, excelling at school, and growing wiser beyond his years. He saw a son who had faced betrayal and heartbreak head-on and emerged stronger, but also colder, harder. Every once in a while, David would catch glimpses of something deeper within Ethan, something vulnerable and fleeting. He'd see it in the way Ethan hesitated before speaking, or how he'd occasionally glance away, lost in thought. In those brief moments, David saw a child who had grown up too fast. David knew he couldn't erase Ethan's experiences or reverse the choices already made. But he could remain by Ethan's side, guiding him, loving him, and hoping desperately that his son's brilliance would remain a force for good. It was all he could do. And for now, it had to be enough.